My name is Sami Bengio, and it's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Michael Kearns has been working in the NIPS community for decades, I must say. He was first at the AT&T labs in the heydays in the 90s, and then he switched to UPenn, where he has been publishing a lot in game theory and social networks, and he's going to talk about very interesting things now. So, Michael, go ahead.
Okay. So thanks, it's great to be here. I actually did not know Ed Posner personally, so I thank John Hopfield for his warm tribute yesterday. But I do know that the point of the Posner lectures is to invite sort of, long-time NIPS insiders to kind of give retrospectives on their work. In other words, it's an extremely flattering way of being told that you're getting old. And so, I'm going to start off by doing what you expect of elderly people. I'm going to spend a little bit of time reminiscing. The first time I ever came to NIPS was in 1991, where I had my first NIPS paper. And, back then it was still a very informal conference. It almost felt more like a workshop. We were back in the long-standing Denver location with the skiing workshops in Vail, which were great fun. And, a short time later, by 1997, I had been sucked into this little world, coming originally from the theoretical computer science community, and I was the program chair for NIPS in 1997. I think I was probably at the very tail end of the period where you just had like a very small program committee and you only had a single program chair. I think I have the distinction of being the last program chair to actually have hard copy physical submissions sent to my office in 10-fold copies, so you could distribute them to all the area chairs. And you can kind of see the kind of, homespun whimsy of NIPS back in those days by this kind of garish poster you see where, on one side you have an island with math and computer science, and on the other side you have an island with biology and all that messy stuff, and inexplicably there seems to be a chocolate bridge between the two, which presumably could either melt or be eaten. And you can kind of go look at these old posters on the NIPS website and kind of see the, kind of everything getting to be a bigger deal, both in terms of the production values of the posters themselves and the glamour of the locations. But lest you think that the poster in the year that I was program chair was the most lurid of them, it's actually a distant second to NIPS 1994. And what could we possibly have been thinking with this poster? It's like I'm really speechless. It's a real classic. But anyway, I am going to go ahead and sort of give a talk that's an overarching survey of a bunch of things that have been kind of kicking around in my head for the last 15 years or so, and the kind of research that they spun out. And it really starts grounded in things that are very, very close to the NIPS community. It starts off with, kind of graph theoretic representations for game theory and other strategic or microeconomic settings that were very directly, you'll see, inspired by graphical models for probabilistic inference. And I'll then say a little bit about I'll make this metaphor a little bit more developed by talking about algorithms for computing equilibria, which is the computation of interest in these models. And I'll talk a little bit about what you can say about the relationships between network structure and topology and equilibrium properties. And then I'll describe this kind of wide left turn that this research took, in the mid-aughts, as they call it, towards human subject experimentations in strategic interaction in social networks. Okay? So let me start off, though, with the basics, which is graphical models for game theory. And before I get, very technical, which I won't do in any case, let me just kind of put this metaphor or analog in your mind. I think you should all be very familiar with the middle column here, in which I'm, kind of revamping what the purpose of graphical models for probabilistic inference is, and in the right-hand column, I'm setting that off against what the analog is in strategic or microeconomic settings. So, in graphical models for game theory, instead of the vertices representing random variables in a joint distribution, they represent players, if you like, people or organizations that are engaged in some kind of strategic interaction. The nature of the interaction, rather than being stochastic, as it would be, let's say, in a Bayes net, is now strategic. The edges, rather than representing probabilistic dependencies, now are representing payoff dependencies, and the actions of individuals influencing the payoffs that other individuals get. And instead of the computations of interest being various kinds of inference like conditional inference or map inference, you're mainly interested in game theory and economic models in some sort of equilibrium computation. Most of you are probably most familiar with Nash equilibrium, but there are other kinds of equilibria as well, including correlated equilibria, which I'll talk a little bit about. And also in things that aren't really games but are more like markets, you have notions of price equilibria. And in the same way that, in probabilistic inference, you're interested in good algorithms for the computations you're interested in, things like belief propagation and others and other variants, you'd like to have the same benefits for game theoretic models, and I'll say a little bit about those analogues which include Nash propagation. And there's one important point of departure in this metaphor, though, which is, if I ask this audience, what's the typical structure of a Bayes net? You'd think that was a weird question. It's kind of nonsensical. The answer is like, well, it depends on the domain, right? In many cases, we view the structure of a Bayes net as something that, as machine learning people, we design to represent whatever particular application we have in mind, and maybe we also, even modify it a bit in various heuristic ways for tractability. Whereas it is reasonable to ask what is the typical structure of a network in which a game theoretic interaction is taking place, because after all, these are models for social systems, right? And so many of you are probably familiar with this now large literature establishing that there are certain universal properties that occur very reliably in large-scale social and economic networks. And so you can actually kind of leverage that and ask interesting questions about the interaction between these structures and equilibrium properties in a way that you couldn't do in the same generality in graphical models for probabilistic inference. Okay? So let me ground this a little bit. This is just one example of sort of many different flavors of kind of graphical models for game theoretic interactions, but it's kind of the simplest one, and it's just called graphical games. In a graphical game, you have an undirected network or graph G over n vertices. You have some action space available to the players. And for each vertex in the graph, and let's call its neighbors, let's call the vertex V and neighbors U1 through UK, there's a payoff function that specifies what the payoff of player or vertex V is as a function of V's own action and the actions of its neighbors. Okay? So, you have a network the same way you would in a Bayes or a Markov net. And now rather than having kind of conditional, sort of local CPTs or local clique potentials, you instead have these payoff functions, these local payoff functions. And so the point here is that non-neighbors do not directly influence each other's payoffs in the same way that non-neighbors in a Bayes net do not directly influence each other's stochastic settings. But they can indirectly influence each other, mediated by the variables along the paths from U to V. Okay, and so the same is going to be true here, right? We're declaring in the semantics of this model that two players that aren't immediately connected don't directly influence each other's payoffs, but at equilibrium, you may need to coordinate the actions of those two players in order to actually reach an equilibrium state. Okay. Okay, so. This is a class of models. You can define it. It seems like a natural thing to introduce, especially in an era where more and more strategic interactions do take place in kind of a large-scale network setting. And in the same way that we like and are interested in good algorithms for performing conditional inferences in things like Markov networks or Bayes nets, we'd like the same sort of thing here, okay? And so, again, the most basic thing you could ask for is a good or, robust algorithm for computing Nash equilibria, okay? And so I'm going to just sketch on this slide, this is probably the most technical slide in the talk, this algorithm called Nash Propagation or Nash Prop in the setting where you have a tree, okay? So here you have a little, very, very small tree, and again, anytime you have some sort of model on a tree, of course, the first thing you think about is some kind of distributed local message passing dynamic programming algorithm, just like the polytree algorithm for Bayes nets, except here you want to perform a Nash equilibrium computation. Okay, and so the way the Nash prop algorithm works at a high level is that there's an upstream pass from the leaves to the root and a downstream pass from the root to the leaves. Inductively, in the upstream pass, if you have a child V with a parent W, really what V wants to pass to W, instead of being a sort of table of a conditional distribution conditioned on evidence elsewhere in the tree, V should pass to W a table of conditional equilibria. So in principle, at a high level, V should pass to W a table that says things like, well, if V plays strategy little v and W plays strategy little w, can those two choices be completed to a Nash equilibrium of the game downstream from vertex V? And if you think about this a little bit, you'll see that this is actually a very easy thing to compute locally, assuming that U1 and U2, the children of V, sent the analogous thing to V. Okay? And then in the downstream pass, by the way, the little tables here are actually showing you the tables from a simple game whose network I'm showing you and whose payoff functions I'm not telling you. But basically, the root doesn't have to pass anything to anybody. It's the root. It has no parents. And so what it ends up computing is just all of the strategies that it could play that can be completed to a Nash equilibrium downstream. The root can kind of non-deterministically choose any one of those, inform its children which choice it's made, and they, from their tables, have enough information to non-deterministically choose a setting for them. Hope I'm not going to have the same problem that John so gracefully dealt with yesterday. And so when I say non-deterministic, I mean, what I really mean is that this algorithm is essentially computing a distributed lattice of all possible Nash equilibria for the game, and you can choose an arbitrary one, you could try to choose a random one, but it's really computing a representation of all of the Nash equilibria. Now, one technical twist here, right, of course, is that if you know a little bit of game theory, when I say the strategies of the players, these might, in general, need to be mixed strategies involving randomization. Like in rock, paper, scissors, the only equilibrium is where both of us flip a three-sided coin. And so really these tables are indexed by continuous, vector-valued strategies over actions. And so you have to decide how you're going to represent that. And there's basically two flavors of this. An exact version, which, of course, in general won't be computationally tractable, and an approximate version that is. Okay? But this is kind of the analog to belief propagation in trees. It's provably correct, it's efficient, and it has this nice, simple dynamic programming formulation. And in the same way that, in probabilistic inference, if unfortunately you don't have a tree and have a cyclical network, there are various, things you can do. You can really do the same things here with very analogous outcomes. So, for instance, you can kind of be disciplined and turn your cyclical graph into a tree by, for instance, the junction tree approach and then paying an exponential dependence on tree width. Or you can take like the loopy belief propagation approach, which is to just run normal belief propagation and not worry about it and hope that everything works out swimmingly. And you can do both of those things here. And so there's, analogs to both of these things that have been worked out nicely in the literature. And there's even, in the same way that in a Bayes net, in a vanilla Bayes net, the basic view is that, you're hoping that the neighborhoods are small. And so you're kind of assuming a world in which each random variable has only a small number of direct stochastic influences, but that might be quite strong. The other extreme, of course, of Bayesian inference is where you assume large neighborhoods and very, very weak interactions, kind of mean field or variational approaches. And you can, again, introduce these sorts of things for game theoretic settings as well. And I'm focusing on games here, the type that most of you are probably familiar with. But all of these ideas can and have been extended to other microeconomic settings, where it's not really a game, but it's some form of network trading, for instance. There are goods available for exchange. There are prices in the network, and people are trading with their neighbors in order to optimize their utility subject to some budget constraint, for instance, as well as things like bargaining and the like. Okay, so many people have worked out all of these analogs, but they all began really firmly grounded in the idea of taking the power of graphical models that's been enjoyed in this community for probabilistic inference and machine learning and importing them to game theoretic and microeconomic settings. Okay. Now, to get back to this question about network structure and topology, one should remember that most people interested in game theory and economics, particularly economists, they have a very different view of the world than, people in this audience, for instance. So in game theory, one is often introducing very specific games and analyzing them to sort of great resolution because you really think that it's a good cartoon of the world and you want to understand what the strategic implications of it are. The best way I can think of describing this is imagine if there was some specific Bayes net that, like Prisoner's Dilemma, in this community had been the subject of like 50 years of careful study, okay? We don't have that in this community. But you are interested in game theory and economics in being able to say things like, well, how does the structure of the interaction or the arrangement of types or payoff functions in a population influence the outcome, okay? And there are many examples that have been worked out where you can say interesting things along these lines. I'm just going to tell you about one of them that actually brings these two fields of probabilistic inference for graphical models and graphical models for game theory in much, much closer technical contact than the kind of metaphors that I've been going through so far. And that's on this topic of correlated equilibria in graphical games. So many of you might know about Nash equilibria but have not heard about correlated equilibria, but it's actually pretty easy to explain to a machine learning audience. In a Nash equilibria, the players might need to randomize, like in rock, paper, scissors. But Nash's celebrated theorem showed that it's always enough for the players to just privately randomize, as we might say. In other words, we both know that the other person is going to flip a three-sided coin to play rock, paper, scissors. But of course, I'm not allowed to see your actual choice, because if I see you flip your three-sided coin and it comes up rock, of course I'll play paper. Okay? So kind of in the language of this community, a Nash equilibrium is a product distribution. It's a joint distribution that happens to factor, and everybody can play it independently. So, a correlated equilibrium, in contrast, is a joint probability distribution over all of our possible joint actions, okay? And to give a simple example where this is an interesting and useful concept, I will introduce the game known as Chicken, which as far as I know is only played in kind of James Dean era movies. But in Chicken, two people drive in their hot rods at high speed directly towards each other. And, you have two actions. You can either go straight or you can swerve, okay? And of course, the goal is to not be the one that swerves and to, kind of get the status that you didn't chicken out, okay? And to describe this as a game, of course, we can say like, well, if I go straight and you swerve, I get a +1, you get a -1. If you go straight and I swerve, you get a +1, I get a -1. If we both swerve, we both get a -1 because we're both humiliated. But if we both go straight, there is a large negative number that represents our collective, both of our payoffs. Okay? So if you put numbers on this, there's basically only two Nash equilibria to the game. And it's basically where one of us always goes straight and the other one swerves, okay? A correlated equilibrium would allow us to condition our strategies on shared randomization. So we could have this coin that's flipped that we both get to see the outcome of, so that's going to correlate our behavior. And I can articulate a strategy that says, if it's heads, I'm going straight. If it's tails, I'm swerving. And it's optimal for you, if that's my strategy, to do the reverse, okay? So what this shared piece of randomization is really, it's like a traffic light in the game of Chicken. Of course, having a traffic light in Chicken obviates the point of playing Chicken in the first place, but let's forget about that. And this is a larger solution space, right? Any Nash equilibrium is a correlated equilibrium, but not the reverse. And this is an example where I've given you a correlated equilibrium that can't be expressed as a Nash equilibrium. And in some sense, it's an interesting one because it gives me a different outcome, right? Rather than one or the other of us always winning or always losing, we're now splitting the wins and losses by use of this shared randomization. There are many, many benefits to correlated equilibria. But sort of if you kind of travel in, especially algorithmic game theory circles these days, I would say it's almost like the kind of equilibrium of choice these days. Because in addition to sort of the benefits I've already described, there are lots of others. First of all, unlike Nash equilibria, which in the worst case cannot be computed efficiently, for arbitrary general sum games, you can for correlated equilibria. And furthermore, there's not just algorithms for computing equilibria, there are distributed, very general dynamics for learning that will cause the players to jointly converge to a correlated equilibria. And in fact, that class of algorithms is exactly the sort of broad class of no-regret multiplicative weight style update algorithms. The one downside to a correlated equilibrium is that however hard it might have been to find a Nash equilibrium, at least you know that the object you're looking for is extremely simple, right? So if it's an n-player game where you think of n as being very large, and let's just say for simplicity, everybody only has two actions, their first and their second action, a Nash equilibrium is just a vector of n real numbers between 0 and 1, which specifies for each player what the probability they say play their first action is. Okay? So at least you're looking for a parsimonious object in the case of a Nash equilibrium. Now we've kind of opened up this can of worms where a correlated equilibrium might be any possible joint distribution over the n equals 2,500 or so people in this room playing some joint collective game. Okay? And this is where graphical models for probabilistic inference kind of come to the rescue in a kind of satisfying way. In the form of a theorem that I'm going to kind of paraphrase here, which is that I give you a graphical game. This is an undirected network with these local payoff functions. And it turns out that any correlated equilibrium of that game can actually be represented by a Markov network on more or less the same graph. Okay? So this is drawing a very direct connection between the structure of the strategic interactions and the structure of the probabilistic dependencies you need in order to achieve correlated equilibrium in that same network. Okay? And one way of interpreting this is that in this little cartoon I'm drawing here, where you've got some distributed spatial network structure, you don't, in principle, once I just tell you what the definition of a correlated equilibrium is, you might, even though you have this network structure, in the worst case, need to correlate very, very distant parties and have very, very high order correlations. Okay? This theorem is telling you, no. You can actually have just local correlations, right? You can the randomness can be localized. And of course, another benefit you get from this is that you can immediately import all of the kind of standard probabilistic independence semantics for reasoning now about the equilibrium of this game. So for instance, if A and B are two players and S is some cut set between A and B, then in any correlated equilibrium conditioned on knowing the actions of the players in the set S, A and B now become conditionally independent at equilibrium. Okay? And so you're really, separating the qualitative interaction, which is represented by the graph, from the quantitative aspects and saying something about the class of all correlated equilibria for any game on that network. Okay? And there are many, many other examples. I just chose this one because I think it's kind of closest to the interests of this audience. But there are many other examples where people have gone and, even for much, here I'm making a universal statement that doesn't, it holds for any network. But lots of other literature in the past 10 or so years has actually looked at specific subclasses of networks, like those generated by standard models for social networks, like preferential attachment and small worlds models, and asked questions like, well, if some sort of trading economy takes place over a network generated by, let's say, preferential attachment or small world models, what can you say about the equilibrium properties as a function of that generative model for networks? And you can, discover interesting things like, preferential attachment networks in kind of a trading setting will generate, great inequality of wealth at equilibrium, right? So somehow, again, it's a theorem that's saying that the kind of imbalanced distribution of connectivity in preferential attachment networks translates to income inequality in a trading model that's taking place over that network. Okay, so let me get to this sort of wide left turn that this research took, around 2005, 2006 or so. And, to again provide sort of elderly historical perspective. I mean, I think from a career, as somebody who has theoretical leanings first and foremost, I'm very aware of the great benefits that I've enjoyed in my career by being surrounded by essentially audiences like this one, of people with a much more applied or empirical emphasis to their work. And I really think, if you think about learning theory and machine learning as a whole, they've really grown up together in a very nice way. I mean, when I first started doing research, Colt and NIPS were very, very far apart in terms of their language and worldview. And now they're kind of seamlessly merged, at least on many, many topics. And it's always been, a great benefit to me to both be around people who look at data and kind of tempted me to do the same, and to get into dialogue that has both theoretical and applied aspects or empirical aspects to it. And so I'm not sure I would have put it exactly this way, but sometime around 2005 or so, I thought, I sort of realized, well, this line of research, there's no data to look at to kind of validate any of these theories. And if you really wanted to test them, they really are theories about how people or organizations will interact with each other in a network setting when there are payoffs and microeconomic considerations at play. And so I started doing these human subject experiments that I'm going to spend the rest of the talk describing. There's not a lot of very, very direct connections to what I've talked about so far, except for this interest in how network topology and structure interacts with strategic outcomes in the form of equilibria or just human subject behavior in sort of small or medium-sized collectives. So just to say a little bit about the kind of setup in these experiments. So what we did for many years are human subject experiments in strategic interaction, in which we would bring 36 human subjects into a laboratory of networked workstations simultaneously. So these are laboratory experiments in which we're bringing everybody together at the same time and same place to participate in these experiments. And in each experiment, a subject will be controlling a vertex in a broader network, which you can think of as being their vertex. And there's only local information and interaction, so you only get to see the state of your own vertex, which you're in control of, and the state of neighboring vertices, which you're not in control of, and you don't get to see the broader graph. I'll show visuals in a second here. In all of these games, it's asynchronous update. Anybody can change their state anytime they want to, and their neighbors will be able to see that update to state. And following the principles of behavioral economics and game theory, we're not paying people for participation in these experiments. It's an eat what you kill model. So we're actually using performance-based financial incentives. And the main design variables that we've been experimenting with over the years, and I'll give an overview of all the things we've tried, is what is the collective task that the subjects are incentivized to try to solve, and what is the network structure, okay? And at a high level, we're interested in the relationship between the outcome of these behavioral experiments and what various theories might have to say about them, right? And these include both equilibrium and computational theories. So we've tried both settings in which game theory had something to say about what it thought should be the outcome of the experiments, and other cases where, for instance, complexity theory would suggest that people should struggle because I'm trying to get them from distributed local information to color complicated networks, right, to find proper colorings, okay? And just to ground this a little bit, here's what a typical screenshot would look like if you were a participant in one of these experiments. Here's a vertex in the middle that's clearly marked U. You see your neighboring vertices. In this particular experiment, which is called biased voting, which I'll return to shortly, all you have to do at each moment of the experiment is either choose to be red or choose to be blue. And you see that you have edges, of course, to your neighbors by definitions. And in this particular GUI, which was common to most but not all of our experiments, we're giving you a little bit of additional information as well. We're also showing you which of your neighbors are connected with each other. This is sometimes called the ego network by sociologists. So you sort of, the idea is you know who your friends are, you know which pairs of your friends are friends with each other and not, but you don't really know anything about the network beyond that picture, okay? And in terms of what kinds of networks, so in all these experiments, we are exogenously imposing various network structures on the subjects, and we're changing that network structure unbeknownst to them in a series of short, i.e. 1 or 2 minute experiments on the same underlying task. And this is just a sampling of the types of networks we've given to subjects. 3 of them here, this one, and this one, these kind of more complicated, unstructured looking networks are drawn from common generative models in the network science literature. So, this is a preferential attachment network. This is a small worlds model in which you have, high clustering of connectivity, but then some modification of it to add or replace that local connectivity with random long-distance connectivity. This is actually a true random graph of the Erdős-Rényi variety. But of course, you can try all kinds of perverse things as well and throw in these highly engineered structures. And so we've done a mix of that, right? And one of the challenges in doing these experiments is that the design space is gargantuan, right? At a minimum, it includes all possible networks over 36 vertices and all possible tasks or payoffs that you could give to the players. And so we had to early on decide whether we focus on kind of one task in a very limited family of networks, or we took the shotgun approach, and the shotgun approach seemed more fun, so we did that. In terms of the tasks that we've given subjects, I'm listing them over here in this table, and also saying what networks were used in the experiments, and then saying kind of a little bit of what the findings are. I'll give a couple of examples in a second. But you can see the tasks are quite diverse. We've given people graph coloring. We've given them the kind of complementary problem to graph coloring, which is instead of wanting to be a different color than all of your neighbors, you want to be the same color as all of your neighbors, which, again, from the viewpoint of centralized computation, nothing could be more trivial. Choose red for everybody, but when you only have local information in a large selection of colors, there's a coordination problem, right? There's just a coordination problem. We've looked at more financial things where the interfaces are more complicated, and I'm not showing them, like networked trading and network bargaining, where rather than kind of picking a color and needing to coordinate with your neighbors, you're actually engaged in exchange of some kind and making offers of trades to each other. We've looked at independent set. We've looked at biased voting, which I'll say a little bit about. But again, you can kind of tell it's a little bit all over the map. But for each one of these, there's some background theory which has something interesting to say. Like for graph coloring, the real question that complexity theory would ask is like, well, can people do this at all? And kind of at what scale and how quickly? And again, always we're interested in the question of how does the network structure interact with the outcome? Are there certain graphs or families of graphs that are much more difficult for human subjects to color than other networks, and how does that compare to, for instance, common heuristics for graph coloring and the graphs that they do better or worse on? Sometimes, like in network trading, there's a very, very precise equilibrium theory which says exactly who should get more wealth at equilibrium and who should get less as a function purely of your position in the network. And so there, in all these cases, we're always revisiting the question of what does the background theory say, whether it comes from computer science or whether it comes from economics, and how does the outcome, the behavioral outcome, vary with respect to different network topologies. Let me give one concrete example that's one of the more compelling and amusing ones from this line of research. So we did one session of experiments on biased voting. Okay, so in biased voting, here are the incentives. So in biased voting, as I showed in the earlier screenshot, at each moment in the experiment, all you have to do is decide whether you're going to choose to be red or choose to be blue. The rules of the experiment are that if within the 1 minute allotted for each experiment, so we bring subjects, the thing that takes a lot of training in these experiments is explaining the task to the subjects. Once they understand the task, it's easy for them to go through a series of that same task on different networks. So in this biased voting session, we had these little 1 minute experiments, about 90 of them or so. And the incentives are as follows. If at any moment during the 1 minute, the entire network is red or the entire network is blue, then the experiment will be ended and everybody will get paid something. Okay? So there's a desire for unanimity. If that state doesn't hold, even if 35 people choose red and one person's holding out for blue, everybody gets nothing. Okay? So the entire population, even though you only have local information, has to reach unanimity of color. Okay? The twist is that in the same 1 minute experiment, my payoff might be that if we reach unanimity to red, I get paid $1.50, and we reach unanimity to blue, I only get 50 cents, and you're the opposite. Okay? So everybody wants to reach unanimity in order to get any payoff, but by making the incentives asymmetric, you make people care about which color they converge to. So it's kind of a classic tension between kind of a global force towards consensus, but there's strong individual preferences in the population. By the way, these experiments were performed at roughly the time of and were directly inspired by the 2008 Democratic primary between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, which you remember was extremely contentious and went on for a very long time, but nobody wanted to force anybody out of the race. But you also had Democratic leadership saying, look, once we figure out who the candidate is, all good Democrats should kind of rally around the winning candidate. Okay, so this is kind of a cartoon model of that. If you're an economist, you ignore that and say, oh, this is just networked battle of the sexes. But now, the interesting experimental design is to choose the network topology kind of in concert with the arrangement of, as I would call them, types in the network, like whether the player gets a higher payoff for red or a higher payoff for blue. And so among these 90 experiments, we did a subset of roughly 30 that had the following form. We generated a network, and we chose the vast majority of the subjects to have a preference for blue, to have a higher payoff for blue. Let's say 30 out of the 36 subjects have a higher payoff for blue, and only 6 of them have a higher payoff for red. Okay? But the rub is that the minority 6 that prefer red were not chosen to be arbitrary vertices. They were chosen to be the vertices with the highest degrees in the network. Okay? And furthermore, the networks were generated according to preferential attachment, where the highest degrees are indeed much, much bigger than the average. So this is a laboratory test of the question of whether a small but well-connected minority can systematically impose its preference on the majority at sort of the expense of the social welfare, right? Because the maximum social welfare solution in such a network is everybody to choose blue, because then 30 people get their higher payoff instead of only 6 getting their higher payoff. And in all of the experiments we did, the whole 90 that includes this subset of 30, the success rate, i.e. the fraction of instances in which unanimity was reached, was something on the order of 2/3. In the subset we did that had this particular structure, the success rate was way over 90%. Okay? So this kind of design was very good for the subjects receiving payoffs. Every single one of those experiments resulted in convergence to the minority preference. Okay? So it's a resounding yes to this question of whether this small but well-connected minority can impose its preference. And lest you find that not surprising, let me remind you that the well-connected minority has no reason to suspect that they're in a special position. And in fact, because they have a large number of neighbors, they're extremely well positioned to see that they are in the minority. Because, of course, in these experiments, what everybody does immediately at the start is enters the game with their higher payoff color, right? So this red minority wakes up and sees themselves surrounded by a sea of blue. And this is an actual series of screenshots from a real experiment, from one of the experiments, and it's quite common that here's one of the red preferring minority who, after a short time, acquiesces because they've seen, presumably, that it's extremely unlikely that they're going to get their higher payoff color because they're in such a deep minority. But somehow it always ends up being the case that these dynamics always work their way back around to the minority preference. Okay? And so this is a nice example of where structure and the arrangement of payoffs within the network says something rather striking about the behavioral outcome. By the way, you might wonder how it's possible to compare results across so many different tasks and wildly different networks. And of course, it's not possible to do so directly. But if you want a sense of just how good people are at this kind of stuff, despite all this diversity, there is one common measure across all these experiments, which is money, right? And so I can always do the following. I can go to any experiment I gave to the subjects, and offline I can compute what I would call the maximum social welfare state. What is the configuration of play by the subjects which would have given them collectively the highest payout, right? That I would have to pay the subjects the most. And I can add up all those numbers across all these different experiments and networks and put it in the denominator. And then in the numerator, I can put the actual total payoff I've given over 6 years of experiments to these subjects. That number is a little short of 90%. Okay? So people are really good at this stuff. They left, only about 10% of the total pie in principle on the table throughout all these years and all these experiments. Okay? So let me just spend the last few minutes talking about the most recent experiments we've done. So in these experiments, the subjects are in the network, right? They are embedded in the network. They are playing an individual vertex and only seeing a local view of information in the network. And I think that was an interesting setting to consider. But even since I started doing this research, I've noticed that just kind of a fascination with networks and a sophistication of thinking about networks has really creeped out of the scientific literature and into popular culture, right? So for instance, this is even well more than 10 years ago, a New York Times article about viral marketing, about, the idea of firms paying people to visibly drink Dewar's scotch and appear to have a great time and be good looking so that other people, would look at that and say, they are having Dewar's over there and they sure look good. I think I'm going to start drinking Dewar's, right? So this was an article about that. This was a later New York Times Magazine article about the research establishing contagion of obesity a few years ago by Christakis and Fowler. And of course, this is a little cartoon about the most recent Facebook emotional contagion study. And so, in the course of doing these experiments, I started to wonder that maybe, not only can collectives of people with only local information in a network do a pretty good job at solving kind of moderate-sized, difficult optimization problems of various kinds, but maybe actually single human subjects can do it given a bird's eye view of the network. Okay? And so we've started doing experiments where and one of the great benefits of these is you don't need 36 people simultaneously participating. You can just do it online. We've been doing experiments in which we see if people can solve graph coloring problems in short amounts of times on reasonably complex networks. And so we're kind of in the middle of this. We've just been doing this recently, but so far we've done experiments on graph coloring. We've done one on competitive contagion, which is basically like a competitive form of viral marketing. So, you have to choose a couple of vertices in a network to seed with an infection. Think of it as being the product that you want to virally spread, but you have a competitor that offers an interchangeable product that also gets to choose 2 seeds. And then there's some stochastic contagion dynamics that determines, based on your choices of where to put your seed infections and where your opponent put them, kind of what happens in the network. And so we recently did a very interesting round of experiments on that. And what we told each player was that you're really solving kind of an evolutionary game theory problem in that you should think of yourself as a player in a 2-player game in which you are one player and the other player is the distribution of seed choices made by everybody else, the rest of the population in the game. Okay? And so this is just a sampling of the graphs we give. And one thing that's nice about this competitive contagion game is you can really encode in it everything from sort of optimization problems where it's just a matter of finding the right seeds to infect, to ones where there's really a coordination problem. So I know this is hard to read, but some of these graphs really have 3 components that are disconnected, and everybody only has 2 seeds, right? So for the population to kind of be at equilibrium, it's like rock, paper, scissors. We shouldn't all choose to play in the 2 component, because then somebody could benefit by being the only person playing in the 3rd component and competing for us for one of the other components. And we're right now in the very middle of seeing whether people are good at finding community structure in moderate networks. And I'm going to just end with a few videos showing you people, again, they're quite good at this. These are now individual subjects that are given a complicated network on a randomized circular layout, right? If your typical layout software for a network might very well be based on the idea of finding community structure and then revealing it to you. Many of the visualizations you see in the popular media of things like Facebook or other social networks are deliberately computing and highlighting that community structure to you. This is the very problem we want them to solve, so we're giving them layouts in which there's no information about the underlying graph structure. It's just a circular layout in which the vertices are randomly ordered. But again, people are surprisingly adept at this kind of stuff. So, here's what the network looks like. This is vastly sped up. But it's not easy for me to look at this and see what the network structure is. The interface allows them to change the layout importantly. And what they're really just asked to do is to, again, choose colors for the vertices, but now the colors represent clusters. So all the vertices I'm coloring red are red clusters. And so I'll just show you, this is, an actual sequence of a subject, moving the layout around. I find it quite interesting that they're doing this without picking any intermediate colors. But in this particular case, relatively quickly, they've actually found the ground truth. Like, we generated this network, planting cluster structure in the network, and they've managed to tease it out quite rapidly. It's also quite interesting to see the varying styles. This is a different subject on the same network, and they're going to do a mixture of making layout changes, but then in some intermediate point, they've decided that they've identified a cluster that they're going to call red, then they do some more layout, and this goes on, and this subject again ends up finding the same ground truth clustering that we used to generate the graph. And there's yet a third way to skin a cat, which it just happens to be among these three subjects on this particular graph the fastest, which is this person didn't touch the layout at all, and relatively much more rapidly, again, found the same ground truth clustering. And we're really literally in the middle of these. The experiment is still active. On networks of roughly this density and size, they were doing fantastically, right? In cases where we knew what the ground truth clustering was, it wasn't that the best subject was finding them. It's like all of the subjects were finding them. So we're in the middle of giving them something a little bit harder. We've asked anybody who wants to in the experiment to go to an app which basically pulls in their Facebook network, the network among their Facebook friends. Those in general will just be too large to visualize at all. They might have 1,000 vertices in them. But so then we're downsampling them in a way that largely preserves the underlying cluster structure. And I'll just close with one example on such a network. So this is a much more complicated network. This now has 60 vertices and a much higher edge density. And I don't know exactly how people are doing this, but I just find it relatively impressive how purposefully they do it and very, very quickly find a clustering, which in this case we don't know what the ground truth is, but we've run several heuristics for clustering, and and using this particular score called the Girvan-Newman score, and they're tying those heuristics, right? They're doing as well as these computational heuristics. I love the way at the end he pulls out this little triangle at the last second, right? But you can see here on the screenshot that they're getting a score of 0.56, and that's also the score that this heuristic gives. Okay, so I'm out of time, and again, in the tradition of the Posner lecture, rather than what a young person might do, which is give some grand vision for the future of this line of research and world domination, I'm going to do the elderly thing, and I'm going to reminisce again and just thank the many, many talented colleagues I had from this community and many others who participated in all aspects of this work, from the very earliest algorithmic modeling theory work through the human subject experiments, including to the ones that we're doing now. And I'll stop and take questions, and thanks for coming.
So we have time for questions.
I think they want you to inconveniently approach these microphones, right? Isn't that the rule?
Yes.
Thanks for a great talk. So there's a natural question about what strategies the humans are using, and can we model that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there's actually sort of a machine learning anecdote there. So one question is sort of, what resolution of modeling you're going for. So first of all, if you look at the individual level, so you're really trying to model specific human subjects, one thing that's interesting is, despite the fact that you will have noticed that in a lot of these experiments, especially the ones where it's a distributed population, you're kind of taking everything it means to be a human being and shoehorning subjects into this insectile-like thing where all they can do is kind of look at the colors of their neighbors. Even despite that, you will see great variation in style of play, traces of personality showing through. An example would be stubbornness in biased voting. I could define an individual to be stubborn in biased voting every moment in which they are playing their higher payoff color, despite a majority of their neighbors playing the opposite color. So you're apparently holding out for your higher payoff. So there's definitely a lot of individual variation like that. Sometimes you can actually kind of build simple models that are pretty good explanations for how people are doing, but I wouldn't call it predictive. So for instance, in biased voting, suppose that the collective, suppose you just want to come up with this little simple local distributed heuristic that when run on the same networks that we gave the subjects, that heuristic, in terms of its convergence time to unanimity, would correlate strongly with the time it took subjects on those networks to, so you're looking for the order of difficulty of the networks to be preserved, if you like, by this heuristic. And for biased voting, you can actually do pretty well with a heuristic that essentially maps your preference to red or blue to a real number between 0 or 1, takes the fraction of your neighbors that are currently 0 or 1 and multiplies them together and then probabilistically plays according to that kind of normalized distribution. So it's a simple heuristic which is deliberately balancing your preferred color with kind of what you're seeing in your neighborhood. And when I say it's, explains a lot but is not predictive, I mean something like, the correlation coefficient is in the sort of high 0.6 range. So it's definitely explaining a lot of the variation, but you wouldn't want to actually use it to predict on further networks what would happen at the collective level. And I think that's kind of the holy grail for some of this research, is to be able to take data from experiments like these, build models of individual behavior, either at the actual human subject level or just some kind of generic heuristic for what people seem to do. But then to take that heuristic, that distributed heuristic, run it on new networks that you've never tried before, and then give those, see what the heuristic says should happen in terms of, let's say convergence time or relative difficulty, and then validate that on a new population of subjects, right? And we haven't done that yet. I don't think we quite have the right scale of data to do it, but I think it's, it would be a really neat thing to do. Yeah.
One more quick question.
Thanks. This is very interesting work, and along a similar theme to what you were just saying, given everything you've learned, are there any specific recommendations we can learn from all this for policy or any particular settings that might be robust to?
Yeah, so I get asked that question, and unfortunately I always kind of, I give the cop-out answer, right? I mean, I think one of the problems that network science as a field has is that to kind of understand things at any depth, you really have to simplify your models so much, right? I mean, even just this idea that, of a social network consisting of an undirected graph, right? I mean, it kind of ignores the fact that individuals have identity, right? And there's something inside the vertex. It's not just the vertex and its neighbors. And I think when you get to things like policy and epidemiology and things like that, you really have to account for that messiness. So unless you're planning on running biased voting experiments and want like policy for how to influence those, I'm reluctant to kind of apply this to Ebola eradication or anything like that.
I think we're out of time now, so let's thank Michael again.